The moment Gertrude Atwood looked up from the dry creek bed and saw the stranger walking toward her camp with the unhurried gait of a man who had nowhere urgent to be and nothing particular left to lose, she felt the familiar dread coil in her chest like a rattlesnake finding shade. She had been crouched beside the bank where the Cimarron had all but given up on itself, that desolate stretch of the Oklahoma Territory where the earth cracked like old porcelain, and the sky pressed down hot and white in the summer of 1882. Her copper pot sat empty beside her boots. The fire she had managed from mesquite twigs and a handful of dry grass was modest and orange, and it threw light across her face in a way that made her look, she knew, like something out of a fevered dream. Dark circles nested beneath eyes the color of creek mud after rain, gray-green and wary. Her hair, the shade of autumn leaves going brown, had come loose from its pins and hung in two long pieces along her jaw. She was 26 years old, and she looked at this world with the expression of someone who had been told a joke, laughed generously, and then discovered the joke had been at her expense all along. The man walking toward her was tall in the particular way of men who have spent years under open sky, not imposing exactly, but present, like a cottonwood standing alone in a field. He wore a battered brown hat with a crease down the center and a sweat stain around the band that told a long story about hard summers. His duster was the color of dust, which in this country meant it was practically invisible, and he walked with a slight lean to the left that was either an old wound or a bad habit. He was perhaps 29, 30 at the most, with a jaw that needed a razor and eyes the brown of good coffee held up to the light. He stopped about 15 feet from her fire the way a man stops when he has been in rough country long enough to know you always wait to be invited in. "Evening," he said. "Evening," she replied, and she did not move her hand far from the shotgun laid across her bedroll. He looked at the shotgun and then back at her face with the unhurried courtesy of a man who was accustomed to being treated with suspicion and had long since stopped taking it personally. "My horse threw a shoe about 2 miles back. I walked her up, saw your fire." He tilted his head slightly to the north where, she supposed, a lame horse stood in the dark. "I don't want anything but maybe a corner of your fire for the night. I can make my own camp if that suits you better." Gertrude looked at him steadily. This was the part where most men pushed, where they said something meant to reassure but that carried the texture of a demand. This man simply waited. "You can sit," she said, "on that side of the fire, and you'll leave that pistol buckled." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he came around and sat on a flat stone she dragged up earlier, setting his bedroll beside him, folding his long legs with a kind of careful economy that suggested they had not had much rest recently. They sat in silence for a while. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote asked a question of the sky and got no answer. "I'm Harlan Collier," he said eventually, not pushy about it, just offering it the way you'd offer a piece of bread. She waited. Then, "Gertrude Atwood." He nodded once, as if the name confirmed something reasonable, and looked back at the fire. The silence stretched out again, and it was a comfortable enough silence, or would have been, except that Gertrude had not had a comfortable silence in so long she had forgotten what one felt like and kept poking at it mentally to see if it was dangerous. "Where are you headed?" she asked, because it was the natural question and because she was tired of poking at the silence. "Wichita, eventually. Got a job offer at a livery there." Though I use the word offer loosely. Man wrote me a letter, I wrote back. Whether the position's still open is anyone's guess. He pulled a battered tin cup from his pack and set it beside the fire's edge without asking if that was acceptable. "You." "Nowhere particular," she said. It came out flat and final, the way she meant it. He glanced at her once, not with pity which she would have resented, but with a kind of straightforward recognition. "All right," he said. "I'd tell you to make yourself at ease," Gertrude said after another moment, "but I should tell you first that you'd be better off camping those 2 miles back with your horse. Creek's dry there too," he said mildly. "I mean," she said, and now her voice went quiet and deliberate the way it always did when she said this, because she had learned that the words landed harder when they were not dramatized. I am bad luck. I have been since I was 19 years old. Every man who has spent more than 3 days in my company has come to grief. My husband died. The man who came after him lost 2 fingers and his mule. The man after that caught a fever and was bedridden for a month. She looked across the fire at him. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you so you can make an informed decision. You should leave. Harlan Collier looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at the fire. He turned his tin cup slowly in his hands, the way a man does when he is thinking seriously and does not want to speak before the thought is done. Then he said, I've never had much luck either. And he sat back down. She stared at him. He seemed entirely serious. He was not laughing at her, not dismissing her. He had simply weighed the proposition, a cursed woman and his own famously absent luck, and apparently decided the math was neutral enough. That is not a reasonable response, she said. No, he agreed, probably not. He poured the last of his canteen water into the tin cup and set it to warm at the edge of the fire. But I'm not a particularly reasonable man. I'm a tired man with a lame horse and 2 miles of dark between me and my bedroll, and you've got a fire. I'll take my chances. Gertrude looked at him for a long moment and then, because there was nothing sensible left to say to a man like that, she pulled her blanket up to her shoulders and looked back at the fire and said nothing more. She did not sleep well. She never slept well. But she slept, and when morning came flat and pink over the Oklahoma plain and she opened her eyes, he was still there, crouched at the reformed fire with a battered iron skillet, frying what appeared to be salt pork and 2 eggs that must have come from his pack. I had 3 eggs, he said without looking up. I'll eat 1, you take 2. Fair trade for the fire. She sat up slowly, pulling the pins from her hair to reset them, watching him. You're still here. I told you I would be. He handed her the tin plate with no ceremony whatsoever, and the eggs on it were slightly overcooked but real and hot, and she had not had a hot breakfast in 4 days. She ate them in silence and waited for the catastrophe that always followed generosity directed at her. A pan falling. A fire catching somewhere it should not. His horse found dead, something. But the morning was quiet. The sky above the Cimarron country went from pink to pale gold, and a pair of scissor-tailed flycatchers crossed the creek bed with their improbable trailing tails, and somewhere behind the swell of land his horse made a sound that suggested it was alive and in moderate spirits despite its bad shoe. What happened to your husband? He asked. Not prying, just asking. She considered not answering, but there was something in the way he asked, the lack of theater in it, that made the answer feel less heavy than usual. Fever 3 months after we married. He was 24, she paused. He was a good man, a farmer. We had 37 acres in Kansas. He planted wheat. I'm sorry, he said, and it sounded like he meant it as a simple truth and not a performance. The wheat came up after he died, she said. Finest crop anyone in the county had seen in years. I sold the farm and left. She set the tin plate down on the stone. The curse works that way sometimes. Takes the person, leaves you with something small and useless to mourn them with. Harlan Collier looked at her then, and for the first time she had a good look at his eyes in the morning light. They were a warm brown with a kind of weathered steadiness in them, like wood that has been out in rain and sun so long it has become something harder and more interesting than it started out as. That sounds less like a curse and more like bad luck piled on top of grief, he said carefully. Though I understand the difference feels academic from where you're standing. She opened her mouth to say something sharp and then closed it again, because that was, she had to admit, an unusually sensible observation. He stood and picked up his pack. I'm going to go see about my horse. If she's sound enough to ride easy, I'll be heading north before noon. If not, I'll need a day. He settled his hat. Either way, I thank you for the fire. She watched him walk off into the morning, that slight left-leaning gait, the duster swinging at his heels, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was uncertainty about whether she wanted someone to leave or stay. She was so accustomed to warning people off and having it work, or watching them stay and suffer for it, that this particular brand of equanimity was disorienting. The horse, whose name turned out to be Cora, was a leggy sorrel mare with a white blaze and an opinionated temperament. The thrown shoe had taken a piece of hoof wall with it, and Harlan said, with the calm pragmatism of a man who knew horses, that Cora needed 2 days' easy rest before being ridden on this kind of ground. So he stayed. He set his own camp a respectful distance from hers, not so close as to crowd her, not so far as to make a point of the distance. He went about his business with the self-contained quiet of a man used to his own company, and over the course of that first day Gertrude found herself noticing things about him the way you notice details about a landscape you've been told is dangerous but cannot stop looking at. He talked to his horse. Not in baby talk, but in the genuine conversational way of a person who has spent long stretches alone and found animals to be reasonable company. He carried a small, much-read copy of the Farmer's Almanac from 2 years prior that he consulted for no purpose she could determine since he was not farming. He had a habit of running his thumbnail along his jaw when he was thinking. He drank his coffee black and without complaint even when it was terrible, and the coffee he made from his own limited supplies was, Gertrude noted with some surprise, quite good. That evening, when the heat of the day had drained out of the land and the temperature dropped the way it does in Oklahoma in late summer, sudden and almost merciful, he came and sat at the common fire area again, this time with a small, battered harmonica that he played quietly and without much showmanship. He was not particularly gifted, but he was sincere about it, and the sound floated out into the dry dark and mixed with the distant coyote chorus in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. Gertrude found herself talking. She did not plan to. It happened the way rivers sometimes find new channels, not all at once but gradually, the water discovering an opening in the rock and widening it just a little at a time. She told him about growing up in Missouri, the 4th child of a tanner who smelled permanently of the trade, a man not unkind but not present in the way she had needed when she was small. She told him about her mother, who had been a practical woman with occasional streaks of unexpected poetry, who would read aloud from whatever book she could borrow, standing at the stove with one hand stirring and the other holding pages, her voice lifting and falling over words she found beautiful. She told him about leaving Missouri at 17 to work as a seamstress in a town whose name she had nearly forgotten, and about meeting James Atwood at 21, and marrying him at 22, and losing him at 22, and how the specific cruelty of that timing had never stopped feeling personal. Harlan listened. He did not interrupt to relate his own experience or make the conversation about himself, which was something Gertrude had never particularly encountered in a man and which she found so startling she kept half expecting him to start. When she ran out of words, he said, "What was his name? Your husband?" "James," she said. "James Atwood. He was from Ohio originally." He used to say Kansas felt like Ohio had been stretched out too thin. She felt the faint warmth of an old memory. He was funny, quietly, the kind of funny where you didn't notice until you were already laughing. "He sounds like someone worth grieving properly," Harlan said. "I've had 4 years," she said. "Grief doesn't always follow the schedule you give it." She looked at him. "Are you always this plain-spoken?" "Mostly." He turned the harmonica in his fingers. "I find it saves time." "And what about you?" she asked, because it seemed only fair. "What's your story, Harlan Collier of nowhere in particular?" He smiled at that, a small and slightly crooked smile that arrived and departed quickly. "I grew up in Texas, near Abilene. My father ran cattle, did reasonably well until he didn't, drought then debt. I left at 19 with a horse and $12 and I've been making my way since then." He looked into the fire. "I was engaged once. Woman named Alice Pryor. She was a school teacher, smart as a whip and twice as direct." He paused. "She waited 2 years and then married a banker from Dodge City who was, I expect, home more reliably than I was." "And that's it?" Gertrude asked. "One engagement." One engagement, 2 or 3 infatuations, a whole lot of lonesome stretches and a lame horse, he said. That about covers it. You don't seem bitter, she observed. Bitterness takes energy, he said. I need the energy for other things. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire between them burned orange and low. The plain beyond was dark and enormous and indifferent, the way the Oklahoma Territory was always dark and enormous and indifferent, and yet the small circle of firelight felt remarkably sufficient, remarkably complete. I still think you should be careful, she said, because she could not entirely let it go. I'll take it under advisement, he said, which was not agreement but was at least acknowledgment, and that night she slept better than she had in weeks. The second day of waiting for Cora's hoof to recover brought new conditions in the form of a mid-morning visitor, a man on a gray gelding who came riding hard from the south and pulled up short when he saw 2 camps instead of 1. He was broad-shouldered and unshaven, and wore the badge of a deputy marshal on his coat like he'd pinned it there in a hurry and perhaps in the dark. Gertrude Atwood, he said, looking at her. She stood up from where she'd been mending a tear in her blanket and squared her shoulders. That's me. Deputy Hal Briggs out of Enid, he said, swinging down from his horse with a grunt that suggested a recent long ride. I've been looking for you for 4 days, ma'am. You left Enid without signing off on a property matter. I didn't leave a property matter unsigned, she said. You did, he said, pulling a folded paper from his coat. The sale of your late husband's farming equipment. You signed the deed of sale for the land but not for the equipment separate. Buyer needs it notarized and filed. He handed her the paper. I'm not here to cause you trouble, ma'am. I just need your signature and a notary. Harlan had come to stand beside the fire, unhurried, with the easy posture of a man who is present but not imposing himself. Briggs looked at him with the frank appraisal of a lawman, and Harlan looked back with the calm lack of alarm of a man with nothing to hide. Nearest notary is Caldwell, Gertrude said, looking at the paper. It was legitimate. She recognized the buyer's name and the description of the equipment, a plow and 2 harrows and a seed drill that had been James's pride. I know it's an inconvenience, Briggs said. He at least had the courtesy to look apologetic about it. It's 3 days north, she said. Closer to 2 if the road's good. He looked at the dry creek. Road's been dry, so. She looked at the paper and felt the familiar weight of James's remaining effects finding new ways to tether her. Even the things she had sold were not done selling themselves. My horse is lame, she said, glancing at Harlan. Another day and Cora will be fine on good road, he said, and she noticed he said it not as an offer but as simple information, leaving the next step entirely to her. She thought about it. Caldwell was north and Wichita was north of Caldwell, and if Harlan was headed to Wichita anyway, you don't have to come, she said to him before he could say anything. I know, he said. I'm not asking. I know that too. He looked at the deputy. There's an office in Caldwell where I can get Cora properly reshod, Briggs said there was. Then I've got a reason to go north anyway, Harlan said, and that was that. They left the next morning, the 3 of them, moving north along the old cattle trail that ran from Texas through the territory and up into Kansas. Briggs was a quiet man when he was not doing official business, and he peeled away toward Enid after the first afternoon, having delivered his paper and confirmed Gertrude's intention to attend to it. That left Gertrude and Harlan riding side by side, Cora walking gingerly but willingly on the hard-packed road, Gertrude's own horse, a compact dun mare named Biscuit that she had purchased in Enid, keeping pace steadily. It was different, riding together. There was a rhythm to it that the campfire had not quite prepared her for. The hours of road had a way of drawing conversation out that sitting still did not, because when you were looking at the same horizon you could talk toward it instead of at each other, and that made certain things easier to say. Tell me about the other men, he said, somewhere in the middle of the second afternoon. The ones who came to grief. She glanced at him. You want the evidence for the curse. I want to understand what you've been carrying, he said simply. So she told him. There had been a man named Porter who had come to help her after James died, a neighbor who had been kind and patient and eventually romantic, and who had lost 2 fingers to a thrashing accident 6 weeks after he began courting her. She had been there when it happened, the blood and the machinery and his bewildered face. She had packed up and left the county within the week. There had been a man named Garrett in a town in the territory, who had given her work as a cook in his roadhouse, and had begun to look at her with a particular warmth, and had then come down with a fever so severe that 3 people in the town had said plainly they expected him to die. He had survived but spent a full month unable to rise from his bed, and when Gertrude had moved on she had felt only relief that he had lived. There was a third man, briefly, whose name she did not say, because it still felt too recent and too private, a man in Enid who had been good to her and had suffered a run of spectacular bad fortune. His storefront burned, his wagon wheel shattered on a perfectly ordinary road, a bad debt called in at the worst possible time over the 6 weeks they had spent in growing closeness, until he had said, gently and without malice, that he thought perhaps they were not suited. And she had understood perfectly what he meant. 3 men, she said, 3 men, and each one paid for knowing me. Harlan rode beside her quietly for a moment. The road stretched ahead through country that was starting to take on the golden grass of Kansas, the change happening so gradually it was impossible to say when the territory ended and the state began. Porter's accident, he said at last. Was it the kind of accident that happens to men who work threshers? Yes, she admitted, and the fever. Men die of fevers in this country all the time. They do, she said, and bad luck in business, fires, debt. These things happen. Not all at once, she said, and her voice had gone a little heated. Not always to people close to me. He was quiet for another moment. Then, I'm not saying your experiences weren't real or that the grief wasn't real. I'm saying the story you've built around them may be doing you more harm than the events themselves. A curse requires believing in it. If you believe you'll bring harm to people, you'll push away anyone who gets close, and then you'll be alone. And then more bad things will happen because you're alone, and you'll say, see, there it is again. Gertrude looked at him steadily. The wind off the Kansas plain pushed at the brim of her hat. That is the most dangerously sensible thing anyone has ever said to me, she told him. Thank you, he said, as if she had been complimenting him. It was not entirely a compliment. I know, the crooked smile appeared and vanished. I'm just saying consider it, that's all. She considered it for the rest of that afternoon and into the evening, when they stopped and made camp near a stand of cottonwoods beside a proper creek that still had water in it. And she sat watching Harlan water both horses with the careful attention he always gave living things. And she considered it the way you consider a door you have kept locked for years and are not sure you are prepared to open. The thing was, she had never found herself this close to a man who had not been, in some demonstrable way, diminished by the proximity. And Harlan Collier riding beside her with his almanac and his harmonica and his plain-spoken ways, and his lame mare seemed, if anything, more himself than when she had first seen him walking out of the dark. She did not know what to do with that information, so she cooked the rabbit he had caught that afternoon and let it sit in her chest quietly, like a coal just beginning to catch. Caldwell, Kansas, in August of 1882, was a town still finding its identity after the cattle drives had begun pushing west. It had the bones of a boomtown, the wide main street, the row of saloons, the land office, the hardware store, the hotel. But there was a new quality to it, a settling, as if the town was taking a breath after years of cattle, money, and chaos, and considering what it wanted to be next. The Long Branch, which had been a saloon, now served food on Sundays. The marshal's office had a flower box in the window that someone's wife had put there, and that the marshal had apparently not had the heart to remove. They rode in on a Tuesday afternoon, dusty and warm, and Gertrude felt the familiar prickling awareness of a woman alone in a western town, the assessing looks from the men on the boardwalk, the way the social mathematics of such a place sorted people quickly and without apology. But she also felt, walking beside Harlan's tall, unhurried presence, that she occupied a slightly different position in those calculations than she did alone, and she was not entirely sure how she felt about that. The notary was a small, nearsighted man named Hoskins who ran an office above the hardware store and who stamped Gertrude's document with the particular satisfaction of a man who loves stamps, and who charged her 30 cents and shook her hand with both of his, and that, finally and properly, was the end of James Atwood's farming equipment. She stood on the boardwalk afterward and felt the paper in her hand, and was surprised to find that she felt lighter. "Done?" Harlan asked, coming out of the hardware store where he had been looking at horseshoe nails. "Done," she said. He nodded. "I found a blacksmith 2 streets over, said he could have Cora rishad by morning." "Good," she said. They looked at each other on the boardwalk in the afternoon sun, the town going about its business around them, and she was suddenly aware that the reason that had held them together for the last 2 days was now resolved. She had her document. He would have his horse rishad by morning. There was no more particular reason for them to keep company. She felt that quite distinctly, like a rug being pulled in small, incremental inches. "The hotel looked reasonable," she said, to say something. "It did," he agreed. She looked down at the paper in her hand. "I suppose you'll be heading to Wichita first thing." There was a pause. She made herself not look at him during it. "I suppose I will," he said. And then carefully, and with the particular deliberateness of a man choosing his words with more care than usual, "though I find I'm in no particular rush for the first time in recent memory." She looked up at him then. He was squinting slightly against the afternoon sun, his hat brim cutting a shadow line across the bridge of his nose, and there was something in his expression that was careful and honest and quietly hoping, all at once. "I'm still bad luck," she told him. "You made that very clear," he said. "I made my position on that clear as well." She looked at him for a long moment. The sounds of Caldwell moved around them, a wagon wheel on packed dirt, a dog bark, a man's laugh from inside the saloon across the street, the piano inside beginning something slow and slightly out of tune. "There's a boarding house on the East End," she said at last. "The woman running it makes supper at 6. I saw the sign." "I did too," he said. "That's not an invitation to anything beyond a meal," she said firmly. "I understand," he said with perfect seriousness. "Good." She tucked the document into her bag. "The blacksmith's on Maple Street. I know where it is." "Then I'll see you at supper," she said, and turned and walked down the boardwalk with her chin up and her heart doing something unfamiliar and alarming and altogether against her better judgment. The boarding house was run by a woman named Martha Greer, who was 50-something and built like a former farmhand, and who made a venison stew of such quality that it briefly, as Harlan later put it, made a man forget every grievance he'd ever held against the state of Kansas. She fed 8 people at her table that evening, 2 traveling salesmen, a young couple moving west, a cattle buyer, Gertrude and Harlan. And she presided over the table with the authority of a woman who had created a small civilization in her own dining room and intended to maintain standards. Under Martha Greer's influence, the table conversation was civil and genuinely interesting. The young couple, the Hendersons, barely 20 and 21, clearly nervous about whatever waited for them in Colorado, talked about their plans with the bright, slightly desperate hopefulness of the recently married, and Gertrude watched them with a complicated kind of tenderness, remembering being that age and that certain. Harlan, she noticed, was good at tables. He asked questions of the cattle buyer that clearly came from real knowledge and interest, and when one of the salesmen made a joke that was slightly off-color given the mixed company, Harlan's expression shifted in a way that was not aggressive but was entirely legible, and the salesman found another direction for his humor. After supper, Martha Greer served coffee on the porch, and the evening was doing its late summer thing of being almost unbearably beautiful, the sky going amber and violet in long horizontal sweeps, the cottonwoods along the street throwing long shadows, and the piano from the saloon floating down the block in the cooling air. The other guests drifted inside or away, and Gertrude found herself sitting on the porch steps with her coffee and Harlan sitting on the porch rail above and to the side of her, and it was the most natural thing in the world except that her heart had not settled all day. "The Hendersons," she said. "Did they seem frightened to you?" "A little," he said. "Colorado's not gentle country to start in. They're so young." "They're in love," he said, as if that were a complete and satisfying answer. She turned her coffee cup in both hands. "Is that an argument in favor or against?" "I'd say it's sufficient motivation to go almost anywhere," he said, and there was something in his voice that was quiet and entirely deliberate. She did not look at him. She looked at the violet sky. "Harlan, Gertrude, I want to say something, and I need you to let me say it without interrupting." He was quiet, which she took as assent. "I have spent 4 years believing I was poison to people who came close to me. And I know you think that's faulty reasoning, and I am not. I am not entirely dismissing what you said on the road. But I need you to understand that it has been a real and present part of my life, that belief, and I have made decisions based on it that have kept me alone for 4 years, and I don't know how to simply set it down because a man with an honest face and good coffee says the math doesn't hold." She paused. "I also need you to understand that I am not a woman who does anything lightly or quickly, and I will not be hurried, and if that is inconvenient to your plans for Wichita, then I understand completely." There was a silence. The violet in the sky deepened to purple. "Are you done?" he asked. "Yes." "Good," he said. "Now let me say something." She tilted her head up toward him, and in the fading light his face was very serious and very kind. "I'm not asking you to set down anything you're not ready to set down," he said. "I'm not asking you to be quick about a single thing. I am asking if I can write to you from Wichita, and if you can write back, and if that seems like something you're prepared to consider, then I think the rest of it has time to work itself out." She looked at him for a long moment. "Letters," she said. "Letters," he confirmed. "Paper and ink, very traditional." Something in her chest, the coil of dread that had been there for 4 years, loosened by perhaps a quarter turn. Not gone, but looser. "That," she said, "I think I can manage." He smiled then, the real one, not the small crooked one but the whole version, and it changed his face considerably. "Good," he said. "Then I'll be heading to Wichita tomorrow, and you can do whatever it is you're going to do, and we'll correspond and we'll see." "We'll see," she agreed, and something about saying it out loud to another person, without the usual protective addendum about curses and bad luck and the wisdom of keeping distance, made it feel like the beginning of something that had been postponed for quite long enough. Harlan left for Wichita the next morning with a properly shod Cora, his almanac, his harmonica, and a piece of paper on which Gertrude had written the address of the boarding house where she planned to stay for the next few weeks in Caldwell, while she thought about what came next. He had touched the brim of his hat to her, and she had said, somewhat formally, "Safe travels, Mr. Collier," and he had said, "Thank you, Miss Atwood," with perfect gravity, and then Cora had carried him north and Gertrude had stood on the boarding house porch and watched until the road turned him away. Martha Greer appeared in the doorway behind her. "That a friend of yours?" "He might be becoming one," Gertrude said carefully. Martha made a sound of benign skepticism that managed to be entirely encouraging. "There's worse things than a tall man with good table manners." "There are considerably worse things," Gertrude agreed, and went inside to write her first letter before he had even cleared the county. She wrote him that afternoon at Martha Greer's kitchen table, the letter beginning 3 times before she found the right opening, the one that was honest without being alarming, that was warm without being more than she was prepared to commit to in permanent ink. She told him about Caldwell, about the way the town felt like a place taking stock of itself. She told him about the flower box in the marshal's window and her theory about the marshal's wife. She mentioned the Hendersons and wondered where they were now, hopefully 2 days closer to Colorado and not too frightened about it. She did not say anything about the previous morning, about the porch and the violet sky and the quarter-turn loosening in her chest. She left that implicit and trusted him to understand. His letter came back 12 days later. Wichita was everything he had expected and nothing he'd feared, which was, he explained, the positive version of how most things in his experience worked, the expectations being low enough that reality had more room to be agreeable. The livery job was indeed still open, owned by a man named Dodd who was fair with wages and better with horses than with words, which Harlan said he found to be a good sign in both a man and an employer. He had a room above the stable, which smelled of hay and horse, which he found he did not mind at all. Cora was settled and had made a decisive enemy of a tall gray gelding in the next stall, which he described with such amused detail that Gertrude found herself laughing alone at the kitchen table, and Martha Greer came in to see what was funny and ended up staying for the whole reading. He had not forgotten the porch. At the end of the letter, in the same plain, deliberate way he said most things, he had written, "I have thought considerably about what you said, and I want you to know that I am in no hurry at all. The only thing I'd ask is that you not disappear into the territory without leaving a forwarding address. I've been lucky enough to find agreeable company once. I'd prefer not to misplace it through inattention." She read that sentence 3 times. Then she wrote back. The letters continued through September and into October, and they became something she had not expected them to become, which was necessary. She had begun to organize her days around them in a way she did not fully acknowledge, until she found herself at the post office twice in a week checking with a hopefulness she recognized as being somewhat undignified and entirely genuine. His letters were regular and straightforward and occasionally very funny, and they got longer, and hers did too, and the things she found herself writing to him were things she had not said to another person in years. She told him about her mother reading at the stove. He wrote back about his father taking him to see a band of Comanche pass through when he was 8, not as something threatening, but as something vast and moving and impossible to reduce to what people reduced it to, and how that image had stayed with him and complicated every simple story he'd been told about this country. She told him about the nightmare she still had about Porter's accident, the blood and the machinery and her own useless hands. He wrote back, "You did not cause that accident. You were present for it. Those are different things, and they have always been different things, and the fact that you were there does not make you responsible any more than a witness is responsible for what they witness. I am sorry no one said this to you sooner." She read that sentence in her small room at Martha Greer's, with the October wind pushing at the window glass, and she sat with it for a long time, and when she put the letter down, she felt that something had genuinely changed in the architecture of what she believed about herself. In November, he asked her to come to Wichita. He was careful about it. He wrote that he was asking in the spirit of information, not pressure, that the town had room and possibility, and that the work at Dodd's livery was stable enough that he was beginning to think about something more permanent, and that if she was still thinking about what came next, as she had said in August that she was, then Wichita was worth considering as a place to consider it, and that he would like very much to continue this correspondence in person, if she was agreeable. Gertrude folded the letter and sat with it through the afternoon. Then she went downstairs and told Martha Greer she would be leaving for Wichita before the hard weather set in. Martha Greer nodded as if she had seen this coming from approximately the second morning at her table. "I'll give you a recommendation for the Parker boarding house on 2nd Street, she said. "Good rooms, respectable house, and it's near Dodd's livery if you're looking for proximity without impropriety." Gertrude looked at her. "Am I that obvious?" "Only to another woman," Martha said cheerfully, and went to find paper for the recommendation. Wichita in November was brisk and bustling, the cattle trail season winding down, but the town itself not winding down at all, having accumulated enough commerce and permanence to have opinions about its own future. The streets were wide and busy, the storefronts painted and substantial, and there was a quality of ambition to the place that Gertrude found both familiar and slightly exhausting. She had been in too many ambitious towns that had come to nothing, but Wichita felt like it might actually make good on its promises. Dodd's livery was on the south end of 2nd Street, a substantial building smelling of hay and horses, and the particular honest smell of hard work well done. Gertrude walked past it twice before she admitted she was looking for Harlan, and on the second pass he came out of the wide doors with a bucket in one hand and saw her standing in the street. The look on his face was something she filed away carefully and took out again many times afterward, because it was not a complicated look. It was simple and clear, the way that faces become clear when what they feel is exactly what it appears to be. He set the bucket down. He looked at her for a moment with that clear, uncomplicated face. "You're here," he said. "I am," she said. "I didn't know the day. I wasn't entirely certain of it myself until I was on the road." He crossed the street to where she stood, and she noticed he was walking without the left lean, which either meant the old wound or bad habit had resolved itself, or she had simply not been seeing him on good ground before. He stood in front of her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because the letters had done what letters do, which is to bring two people to a point that conversation has to cross without the benefit of all that preparation. Then she said, "I am still not promising anything." "I know," he said, "and if anything terrible happens to you, I reserve the right to say I told you so." "Understood," he said, completely straight-faced. "Good," she said. "Welcome to Wichita, Gertrude," he said, and his voice when he said her name was the warmest she had ever heard anyone say it. She was in Wichita. The Parker boarding house was, as Martha Greer had promised, respectable, clean, with a landlady named Mrs. Parker who enforced the rules of her establishment with the particular certainty of a woman who had thought them through carefully and found them sound. No male callers after 7. Supper at 6. No exceptions. Church on Sunday was strongly encouraged, though not technically compulsory, though Mrs. Parker's tone made the technical distinction somewhat theoretical. Gertrude took a room on the 2nd floor with a window overlooking the street, and settled in with the careful economy of a woman, accustomed to moving frequently and not accumulating what she could not carry. She found work quickly, because she was skilled with a needle, and Wichita had a dressmaker on Kansas Avenue who needed an extra hand through the winter season, and Mrs. Haverson proved to be a reasonable employer with a sharp sense of humor and a genuine appreciation for quality work. She saw Harlan most evenings. He would come and meet her after supper, when the streets were still busy enough to be entirely respectable, and they would walk, because Wichita was a town made for walking in the evening, and they would talk the way they had in letters, but with the added dimension of expression, of inflection, of the particular pleasure of being able to watch someone's face when they said something interesting. He walked her through the parts of the town he had learned in his 2 months there, showing her the good bakery and the reliable hardware, and the church with the cracked bell that rang every Sunday at slightly the wrong pitch, and had apparently been the subject of a town dispute for 3 years. He showed her the river and the cottonwoods along it and the view west when the last sun was painting the sky, and she stood there in November with her coat, collar turned up and her breath making small ghosts in the cold air, and thought quietly that she had not felt this much like herself in years. The curse, she had begun to think, was not working as advertised. Harlan was entirely unharmed. He had not contracted a fever or lost any fingers or suffered any remarkable misfortune since the lame horse, which had happened before she was even a factor and was therefore inadmissible as evidence. She did not say this out loud. Some things needed to be believed slowly and quietly before they could be said. In December, there was a snowstorm that shut Wichita down for 3 days. The streets filled up white, and the town went quiet in the way of towns under snow, all the usual noise muffled and replaced by the sound of wind and the creak of cold wood. Gertrude was confined to the boarding house, and Mrs. Parker, to everyone's slightly surprised approval, made hot cocoa from what was evidently a private reserve and played cards with her boarders through the long afternoons. On the second day of the storm, there was a knock at the front door in the middle of the afternoon, and when Mrs. Parker opened it, Harlan was on the porch with a wool scarf wrapped around him that he had clearly borrowed from somewhere, holding a paper bag that turned out to contain 4 apple fritters from the bakery, the baker having apparently not let a blizzard interfere with production. "Mr. Collier," Mrs. Parker said, in a tone that was not quite disapproving. "Mrs. Parker," he said, with perfect courtesy, "I thought the house might appreciate something from the bakery. I wasn't going to come past the parlor." Mrs. Parker looked at him, then at the fritters, then back at him, and apparently decided that apple fritters were their own argument. She let him in. He sat in the parlor with Gertrude and 2 other boarders, a retired schoolteacher and a young woman who did millinery, and they ate fritters and played cards, and the storm threw itself at the windows, and the room was warm and lamplight golden, and Gertrude was sitting across from Harlan watching him lose cheerfully at whist, and she felt something so large and uncomplicated that she almost put it into words on the spot. She didn't. Not yet. But it was there, solid and warm and completely certain, like a foundation that had been laid for a while and was now ready to hold weight. After the storm, in the first week of a cold and clear December, she was walking back from Mrs. Haverson's in the early dark when she heard loud voices from the alley beside the grain merchant's building. She stopped, because women in western towns learned which sounds to stop for, and through the dim light she made out 4 shapes, 3 men and 1 smaller figure who turned out, as her eyes adjusted, to be a boy of perhaps 14. She could not hear the full conversation, but the shape of it was clear enough. The 3 men were blocking the boy's way, and the boy was frightened, and doing his best not to show it. She looked around for help. Across the street, Harlan was coming around the corner from the direction of the livery. She stepped into the alley and said loudly and clearly, "Boy, your father's been looking for you. I told him I'd fetch you straight home." She said it with the absolute authority of a woman who has been decisive since necessity taught her to be, and the 3 men turned to look at her. There was a moment of assessment, the kind that happens quickly and ends in one of 2 directions. Then Harlan walked into the alley behind her. He did not say anything. He was simply there, tall and steady in the lamplight, and the particular quality of his stillness was not a threat exactly, but was entirely readable. He had the patience of a man who had no particular objection to waiting as long as necessary. The 3 men looked at him and then at each other and then at the boy and decided, as men in these situations usually do when the calculation shifts, that they had somewhere else to be. They moved off, not quickly, maintaining some dignity, but they moved off. The boy stood against the wall, breathing fast. He was 12 at the oldest, dark-haired and lean, with the careful expression of a child who has been on his own for at least some portion of his life. "You all right?" Gertrude asked him. "Yes, ma'am," he said with studied dignity. "What's your name?" He hesitated. "Thomas." "Thomas, are you in a situation where you need help? Not from those men," she added firmly. "Actual help." He looked at her and then at Harlan, and his careful expression flickered for just a moment into something younger and more honest. "I'm looking for work," he said. "I've been looking for 2 weeks. Those men said they had work, and then it wasn't the kind of work they said it was." Harlan said quietly, "Can you muck out stalls?" Thomas looked at him. "Sir." "Stalls, in a livery." "Early morning work. Mr. Dodd's been wanting a helper for the early shift." The boy straightened. "Yes, sir, I can do that." "Come by tomorrow morning at 6, Harlan said. "I'll put in a word." Thomas nodded, with the particular gravity of a boy trying very hard to look like he hadn't just been rescued, and walked away into the dark with considerably more confidence than he'd had 3 minutes ago. Gertrude stood in the alley and looked at Harlan. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "That was a good thing to do." He looked slightly awkward, the way genuinely good people sometimes do when goodness is pointed out to them. "Dodd does need a hand." "Yes," she said. "I'm sure that's the primary reason." She stepped out of the alley onto the street, and he fell into step beside her, and the cold December night was clear and full of stars, and she had been thinking about the foundation all week, about what it was ready to hold. She stopped walking. He stopped walking. "I need to say something," she said. "All right," he said. She turned to face him. The street was quiet, the buildings on either side throwing warm light onto the packed snow, and his face was clear and steady in that light the way it always was when she was about to say something important. "I don't think I'm cursed," she said. He waited. "I think I was afraid," she said. "I think I was so afraid of losing another person that I built a story that would keep people at a distance and call it protection. And I think I've been carrying that story for 4 years, and it has been extraordinarily heavy." "Yes," he said, "I expect it has been. And I think," she stopped, started again, "I think I'm in love with you, Harlan Collier. I think I've been in love with you since at least the second morning when you made those overcooked eggs and handed me the plate like it was nothing, and probably before that. And I am telling you now because I am tired of carrying things that don't need carrying. And I am telling you plainly because you have always spoken plainly to me, and you deserve the same in return." Harlan looked at her for what felt like a very long time, which was probably 5 seconds. Then he said, "I've been in love with you since you looked at me across a campfire in the dark and told me I'd be better off leaving, and I thought, not likely." The laugh surprised her, bubbling up sudden and warm, and he was smiling, the full version, and she stepped forward and he met her halfway, his hands finding her face in the careful way that all his movements were careful, and he kissed her in the middle of a Wichita street in December with the starlight on the snow, and the distant sound of the cracked church bell doing its nightly off-pitch business. And it was exactly as good as 4 months of letters and long walks and apple fritters in a snowstorm had led her to believe it would be. January in Kansas settled in with the serious cold of a plains winter, the kind that was not to be argued with, and Wichita went about the business of being a town in the deep part of the year. The cattle trail was empty. The merchants were taking stock. The church had raised enough money to finally fix the cracked bell, a fact that divided the town along curiously passionate lines between those who felt this was long overdue and those who had grown fond of the bell's imperfect character. Harlan had been promoted, of a kind, by Mr. Dodd, who had recognized in him the particular quality of someone who could be trusted with the business end of the stable's accounts, and not just the horse end, and who had quietly begun including him in conversations about what the livery should look like in the coming year. Thomas, the boy from the alley, was turning out to be a dedicated and capable worker who arrived every morning precisely at 6 and treated every horse in the stable with an attentiveness that impressed Dodd considerably. Gertrude's dressmaking work with Mrs. Haverson was going well, and she had begun to develop her own small clientele, women who came specifically to her for alterations and smaller commissions. She was good at this work, and she had always known she was good at it, but there was something different about being good at something in a place where she expected to stay, as opposed to the transient competence of someone always half ready to move on. She was thinking, quite seriously, about staying. On a Sunday in late January, Harlan walked her home from church through the cold and clear morning air, and they stopped at the bench in the small square near the boarding house, the one that sat in a patch of winter sun that could, even in January, be persuaded to feel almost warm. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. His expression was the careful, deliberate one, the one he wore when he was about to say something he had thought through completely. "I spoke to Mr. Dodd this week about the possibility of a partnership arrangement," he said. "Not immediately, but as a path. He's been thinking about taking a step back over the next year or two, and he needs someone he trusts with the business. I think there's something real there if I handle it right." He paused. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that I am thinking about permanence, that I am thinking about a permanent life in this place. And I want to know if that is a direction you are, if that is something you could see yourself as part of." She studied him. "Are you asking me to marry you, Harlan Collier?" He met her eyes. "I'm building toward it," he said honestly. "I'm asking if I should keep building." She sat with it for a moment. The winter sun was doing its best on the bench, and the town moved quietly around them, and James Atwood was 4 years gone and had been good to her, and deserved to be remembered with love and not as an argument against living. And Harlan was looking at her with that steady, warm coffee gaze and waiting without pressure for whatever she decided to say. "Keep building," she said. He exhaled, not dramatized, just a real breath, the kind a person takes when something important has been settled, and took her hand in the formal, public way that a man takes a woman's hand in 1883 in a town square, which is to say with propriety and care. And she let him hold it in the January sun, and thought that whatever the next thing was, she was not afraid of it. He proposed properly on an evening in March, in the small parlor of the boarding house with Mrs. Parker's somewhat thunderous permission to have a private conversation, and he did it with a ring he had commissioned from the jeweler on Main Street, a modest and very beautiful thing with a small amber stone that he said, when she raised an eyebrow at the color, reminded him of creek water held up to the light, which was, she told him, either the most romantic or the most peculiar description of an engagement ring she had ever heard. She said yes. Mrs. Parker wept, which she did with great efficiency and dignity, and then produced a bottle of something from a private reserve that she had apparently been saving for a significant occasion, and poured 3 small glasses and said, "Well, that's been coming since November," and they drank to it in the small, warm parlor while the March wind complained outside. They were married in May. The wedding was small and genuine, held in the church with the now properly tuned bell, which rang on their morning with a clear, full note that struck everyone present as appropriately celebratory. Martha Greer came up from Caldwell for it, which pleased Gertrude enormously. Thomas, who had become in the intervening months something like a fixture in both their lives, served as one of the witnesses, wearing a jacket that was slightly too large but that he wore with great dignity. Mr. Dodd attended with his wife, a tall, quiet woman with a dry sense of humor, who took an immediate liking to Gertrude, and told her privately that Harlan had talked of nothing else since October, and that it was a relief to everyone at the stable that this was finally resolved. Gertrude wore a dress she had made herself, ivory cotton with small blue flowers embroidered at the collar and cuffs, and she walked into the church with her chin up and her eyes clear. And when she saw Harlan standing at the front in his good suit with his good face turned toward her, and that clear, full version of his smile on it, she felt nothing like a woman who had once thought herself incapable of this. She felt like herself, fully and completely herself. The minister was brief and sincere. The vows were the traditional ones, and Gertrude meant every word of them and heard in Harlan's voice when he said them that he meant them too, and that was the whole of what was required. They were given a house. This was not entirely expected. Mr. Dodd, it emerged, owned a small house on the east end of 2nd Street that had been a rental property, and that he offered to Harlan and Gertrude on the occasion of their marriage at a rental well below what it was worth, with the provision, stated with gruff brevity over a handshake, that if Harlan followed through on the partnership arrangement, the house would eventually become part of the deal. Mrs. Dodd told Gertrude that this was the most sentimentally motivated business decision her husband had made in 20 years, and seemed both mildly amused and genuinely touched by it. The house was white and needed paint on the south side, and had a front porch that faced west, which meant evenings on it were illuminated by the most extravagant sunsets that Kansas had to offer, which was not nothing. There was a kitchen with a good stove and a bedroom with a window that let in the early morning light, and a small spare room that Gertrude looked at for a moment on the first walk-through and said nothing about. They spent the first week of their marriage painting the south side of the house. This was not romantic in any conventional sense, but there was something in the shared physical work of it, the paint-speckled discussions about whether the existing white was the right white or whether a cream would be better, the lunch breaks on the front steps with sandwiches and coffee, the companionable exhaustion of the evenings that was deeply satisfying in a way Gertrude had not anticipated. She had been alone for a long time. She was no longer alone. It was as simple and as enormous as that. Harlan, she discovered in the daily intimacy of a shared home, had other qualities that the letters and the courtship had hinted at, but not fully revealed. He was a good sleeper, which she envied in the way of someone who slept badly, and he woke up in a good enough temper to be constructive, which she had not entirely taken for granted as a given. He maintained a small practice of reading in the evenings, usually something practical but occasionally, to her quiet delight, something unexpected. He had a copy of Great Expectations that had been given to him by a schoolteacher in Texas, and that he had apparently read 4 times, and he had opinions about it that were specific and genuine, and led to several conversations of considerable depth. He was patient with her nightmares, which still came sometimes, though less frequently. The first time she woke with a gasp in the dark of their bedroom, her heart going hard, he was awake beside her without question, his hand on her arm, steady and unremarkable, as if this were simply something that happened sometimes and required presence rather than commentary. She leaned against him in the dark and let her breathing settle, and he did not say anything because there was nothing necessary to say. And eventually she slept again. And in the morning he made coffee and they did not discuss it, and it was the kindest possible way to handle it. Summer came, and Harlan's partnership with Dodd moved formally forward, paperwork signed and witnessed with the same notary who had stamped Gertrude's property document 9 months and a lifetime ago, and Dodd shook his hand with both of his, and his wife squeezed Gertrude's arm and said, "Good. Now maybe he'll sleep nights instead of worrying about the business." Thomas turned out to have a genuine gift with horses, the kind that is not teachable because it is not technical but instinctive, a quality of attention that animals recognized and responded to. Harlan began paying him a proper wage and teaching him the business end of things as well, and Gertrude had begun to notice that when Thomas came for supper on Sundays, which had become a standing arrangement that none of them had formally agreed to but all of them maintained, he was putting weight on, and the careful expression had settled into something more like simple confidence. By autumn, Gertrude knew she was expecting. She told Harlan on a September evening on the front porch, the west sky doing its elaborate best, the cottonwoods along the street golden with the turning season, and she said it plain and direct because that was how she said everything important. His face went very still for a moment, the complete stillness of someone receiving information too large for immediate expression, and then it broke open into something she had not seen before, a joy that was wide and undefended and entirely, completely uncomplicated. He put both hands over hers where they rested in her lap and looked at her and said, "Gertrude," just her name, but the way he said it had everything in it. "I know," she said. "Are you?" "I'm well," she said. "I'm more than well. I'm telling you because I want you to know, not because anything is wrong." Nodded, but he didn't stop holding her hands or looking at her, and after a moment he said, "I am the luckiest man in Kansas." "That is a low bar," she said, "given the competition." He laughed, the full, real laugh that she still considered one of her better discoveries. "It's true regardless of the bar." She looked at the golden cottonwoods and the wide sky and felt the evening settling around them like a thing that had always been intended. "Maybe you were right," she said. "About what?" "About luck. About how you make it." She paused. "I sat down beside a dry creek with a woman I had been warned about, and it led me here." "You weren't warned about me," he said. "You warned me." "I did," she said, "and you completely disregarded it." "Best decision I ever made," he said. "It really was," she agreed, which was not something she would have said with any degree of ease in, say, August of last year, but which she said now with complete and genuine conviction. And he brought her hands up and held them for a moment, and the Kansas evening came down golden and full around the White House on 2nd Street. In February of 1884, their son was born. The birth was attended by the doctor and Mrs. Dodd, who had appointed herself to this purpose some months prior, and was entirely unarguable on the subject. It was a long night and a harder labor than any of them would have preferred, and Gertrude had not, in these hours, thought once about curses. She had been far too busy with the serious business of bringing a person into the world. Harlan had spent the night in the kitchen below, not being allowed upstairs, which he had accepted without complaint but which he had evidently processed through a significant quantity of coffee and considerable pacing. Because when Mrs. Dodd called down the stairs that mother and son were well and doing fine, he took the stairs 3 at a time. She was exhausted and triumphant in equal measure, propped against the pillows with the baby in her arms, and Harlan came to the bedside and sat on the edge of it and looked at his son with the same open, undefended joy he had shown on the porch in September, and she watched him look at the baby and felt something so enormous she had to close her eyes for a moment. "He looks like he has opinions already," Harlan said softly. "He was born with a very certain expression," Mrs. Dodd confirmed from the doorway, which was apparently not enough cue for her to give them privacy yet. "What shall we call him?" Harlan asked, looking at her. "I was thinking James," she said carefully. He looked at her, and she saw him understand immediately, and she saw him find it good. "James Collier," he said. "James Harlan Collier," she said. He took her hand, with the paint-stained and work-worn hand of a man who built things, and held it in both of his and looked down at James Harlan Collier, who weighed somewhat less than 7 pounds and already seemed to be taking stock of the situation with something resembling resolve. "Welcome to Kansas," Harlan told his son very quietly with complete seriousness. "He'll have opinions about it," Gertrude said. "Good," Harlan said. "So do I." Spring of 1884 arrived with more generosity than the previous year, the rains coming properly in April, and the trees going green along the river and the town of Wichita, expanding in the optimistic way of towns that have decided they are here to stay. Dodd completed his step back from the livery with full handshakes and the relief of a man handing over a well-loved thing to someone he trusts absolutely. And the sign above the stable door was repainted to read Collier and Dodd livery, established 1882, the date being Dodd's original founding, which Harlan had insisted on keeping, and which Dodd had received with the kind of gruff gratitude that constituted his most emotional register. Thomas, now 15 and grown considerably in both height and confidence, was formally taken on as an apprentice in a manner that had some legal standing to it. He had a room in the boarding house near the stable. He ate Sunday suppers at the house on 2nd Street as a matter of course, and he had been the first person outside the family to hold James Harlan Collier, and had done so with an expression of profound seriousness and complete delight. Gertrude wrote to Martha Greer every month. Martha wrote back with news of Caldwell, which was becoming more settled and less wild by the year. She had taken on 2 boarders for the winter who had decided to stay through spring, and she was thinking about adding a room. She sent a baby blanket in February that was the softest wool Gertrude had ever touched, and that James Harlan used until it was more memory than fabric. On a warm evening in May, Gertrude sat on the front porch with James on her lap and a letter from Missouri in her hand that was the first contact she'd had from her family there in 2 years. Her youngest sister had married in the fall and was expecting her first child in June. Her mother was well. Her father had sold the tanning business and was living on the proceeds in a state of cautious satisfaction. There was no drama in the letter, no particular event, and she had been afraid there would be, afraid that the news from home would arrive with a kind of reproach for how long she had been gone and how little she had written. But it didn't. It was just a letter from home, warm and ordinary, and her sister had enclosed a small pressed flower from the garden, a habit she had apparently maintained since they were girls, and Gertrude held it and looked at James on her lap and thought about distance and time and what you kept and what you let go, and decided that a letter back was overdue and would be written tonight. Harlan came home from the livery when the sky was going orange and found her on the porch with the baby and the letter and the pressed flower, and he stood at the gate for a moment looking at the picture she made in the evening light, and she looked up and saw his face and said, "Stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" he said. "Like I'm a painting." "You look like a painting," he said, coming through the gate. "That is objectively not true." "Objectively," he said, sitting in the chair beside hers and looking at the orange sky, is a word people use when they mean subjectively but want to win the argument. She looked at him. He was smiling at the sky. "You've been spending too much time with that book," she said. "Probably," he agreed, content. James made a noise of investigation, reaching toward the pressed flower in her hand, and she let him look at it, and he investigated it with the thorough, purposeful attention of a 4-month-old who takes all phenomena seriously. "My sister's expecting," Gertrude said. "That's good," Harlan said. "My mother's well. Good. I think I'll write back tonight." "I'll hold the baby," he said. She looked at him, at the side of his face in the orange light, the jaw she had once thought needed a razor, and that she now recognized as simply being the face she knew best in the world. The reliable, good, warmly human face of a man who had sat down beside a fire when told he should leave and had never had much luck either, and who had meant it, and who had turned out to be the luckiest thing that had ever happened to her. "I was so sure I'd ruin you," she said. He turned to look at her. The orange light was doing something extraordinary with the sky, the kind of sunset Kansas periodically produced as if to justify the hardship of the rest of the year. "You were wrong," he said gently. "I was very wrong," she agreed. "It happens," he said. "Not to me usually." "Lucky for both of us," he said. She laughed, and James made his sound of response to her laughter, the gurgling, bright-eyed response of a baby who had learned that his mother's laugh was one of the reliable pleasures of the world. And Harlan reached over and took her free hand and held it the way he always held it, with simple, uncomplicated certainty. The sun went down over Kansas in a long wash of amber and gold, and the cottonwoods along 2nd Street went dark against it, and the new bell in the church rang the hour cleanly. And from 2 streets over came the sound of someone's piano, and from the livery at the end of the block came the sound of horses settling for the evening. And the white house on 2nd Street with its newly painted south side was lit from within, and the porch looked west, and everything was, for the moment, and for a considerable number of moments to come, entirely and completely all right. Gertrude Atwood Collier, who had once crouched beside a dry creek in the Oklahoma Territory and looked up at a stranger and felt the familiar dread, and told him plainly that she was cursed, and he should leave, set down the pressed flower in her lap, and looked at her husband and her son in the long golden light and thought, "Here it is. Here is what was on the other side of all that fear. Here is the thing the curse could not touch." The summer moved through the house on 2nd Street with the particular pace of seasons that have earned their ease, each day folding into the next with the satisfying rhythm of a life that has found its shape. James grew with the fierce intention that good health and attentive parents produce, reaching and grasping, and making his opinions about the world known through a range of vocalizations that Harlan cataloged with great enthusiasm, and that Gertrude translated, mostly correctly, and that Thomas, on Sunday evenings, received with the diplomatic patience of a young man learning to be a responsible older figure in a child's life. In the fall, when James was 7 months old and sitting up with the determined stability of someone who has decided this skill is worth mastering, Gertrude returned to her sewing work part-time, taking commissions at home now rather than at Mrs. Haverson's, a distinction that suited the current shape of her days. She had built a small but loyal clientele, women who valued her eye for fit and her honest opinions about what worked and what didn't, and who had learned that her assessments, while not always diplomatic, were always correct. Mrs. Haverson came to her one October afternoon, ostensibly to drop off fabric for a commission, but actually, as became apparent, to have a conversation she had been thinking about for some weeks. She sat at Gertrude's kitchen table and drank coffee and told her that she was considering retiring. The shop on Kansas Avenue was doing well. The building was owned outright. She wanted, she said, to go to Denver where her daughter lived and spend some years being someone's grandmother rather than someone's dressmaker, and she thought that Gertrude was the right person to take the business on. Gertrude looked at her across the kitchen table for a long moment. "I can't afford to buy it," she said. I'm not talking about buying it outright, Mrs. Haverson said, with the patience of someone who had worked the numbers. I'm talking about an arrangement. You pay me what the business earns beyond your costs on a schedule until it's paid. You know the work. You know the clients. They already trust you. She paused. And you need something of your own, Gertrude. Outside this house, capable women always need something of their own, regardless of the quality of their marriages. Gertrude looked around her kitchen, at James in his basket, at the fabric draped over the chair that was always covered in fabric, at the morning light on the table, and she thought about James Atwood's farming equipment and the 37 acres she had sold, and about all the years she had been moving and what it meant to stop. Yes, she said, I'll do it. She told Harlan that evening, and he received it with the straightforward, genuine pleasure of someone who had expected nothing less, and who was also, she noted privately, relieved to have a further explanation for the chronic state of fabric-covered chairs in their home. The business was formally hers in January of 1885, by which time James Harlan Collier was nearly a year old, and pulling himself to standing on anything that would tolerate the procedure, including the low shelves of the dressmaking shop, where he was sometimes brought when care arrangements with Mrs. Parker, retired now from her boarding house, but available and delighted for such purposes, were not possible. The clients found this charming, and James found the shop's supply of interesting textiles to be among the more rewarding features of his young life. It was in the shop, on a February afternoon, that Gertrude received a visitor she had not expected. A woman of perhaps 40 came in from the cold with the look of someone who had traveled some distance and was not entirely certain she was in the right place. She was well dressed in the careful way of someone who makes quality last a long time, and she had a particular quality about her face, a directness that was somehow familiar without being recognizable. "Are you Mrs. Collier?" she asked. "I am," Gertrude said. "I'm Margaret Pryor," the woman said. "My daughter Alice, you may not know of her, she was acquainted with your husband some years ago." Gertrude looked at her steadily. "Alice Pryor, the schoolteacher, the engagement." "Yes," she said pleasantly. "I know of her. Please sit down, Mrs. Pryor." Margaret Pryor sat, and it turned out that she had not come with any particular agenda of the kind that Gertrude had instinctively prepared herself for. She had come because she was passing through Wichita on her way to Topeka, where her sister lived, and because Alice had written her that Harlan Collier was there and married and doing well, and Margaret Pryor was, it turned out, the kind of woman who believed in making things right, and she had always felt, she said, that she had not been kind enough to Harlan when things had ended between him and Alice. "He was a good man," Mrs. Pryor said. "My daughter was not wrong to want more certainty than he could offer then, but she was wrong to handle it without more grace. As was I." She looked at Gertrude with direct and earnest eyes. "I'm glad he has done well. I can see from this shop and from looking at you that he has found someone suited to him." Gertrude felt something shift in her chest, not dramatically, just a small settling. "He is very well," she said. "We both are." "Good," said Margaret Pryor, and accepted a cup of coffee and stayed for 20 minutes and talked about the kinds of things two women of good sense talk about when they are in agreement on the important points. And when she left, she shook Gertrude's hand warmly and said she hoped they would have many good years ahead of them, and Gertrude said she believed they would. She told Harlan that evening. He received it with a thoughtful quiet and then said, "Alice always had a decent mother. I'm glad to hear she's making good use of her." "Are you at all, does it bring anything up?" Gertrude asked, because they had learned early in their marriage that she asked these things directly and he answered them the same way. He considered it honestly. "Gratitude, mostly," he said. "If things had gone differently then, I'd have been in a different place when I walked toward a campfire in the Oklahoma Territory." "Fate," she said. "Good luck," he said and smiled at her. She reached across the table and touched his face, the evening face with its day's worth of growth and its warm, reliable eyes, and thought about the creek bed and the dark and a man walking out of it with a lame horse and nowhere urgent to be. "Yes," she agreed. Good luck. Spring found them all settled and growing and present in the ways that matter. Thomas turned 16 in March and received from Harlan and Gertrude a proper tooled leather saddle and from Mr. A gelding of his own to put it on, and the combination of these gifts produced in Thomas the only instance Gertrude had observed of him being entirely at a loss for words, which she found more moving than any eloquence would have been. James took his first steps in April, early by any measure, with the determined expression he had apparently decided was his signature mode. He crossed the width of the parlor between his father's outstretched hands and his mother's waiting ones, 7 unsteady steps that each one of them, including Thomas who happened to be there for Sunday supper, received as if they were watching something genuinely momentous, which they were, because all first steps are genuinely momentous even when they are also just locomotion. Gertrude wrote to her mother and described it, and her mother wrote back with the particular warmth of grandmothers who have not met their grandchildren yet and are considering whether to remedy that. And by midsummer there was correspondence about a visit, and by fall the visit was planned, and in October, for the first time in 8 years, Gertrude saw her mother. Hannah Atwood, she had not taken the name Collier, preferring to carry her own history as she always had came on the train from Missouri with a traveling bag and the expression of a woman who has made up her mind to something and intends to see it through. She was 61, smaller than Gertrude remembered, with white hair worn in the same neat arrangement she had always kept and eyes that were her daughter's eyes, gray-green and perceptive. She held James Harlan Collier for the first time in the front parlor of the White House on 2nd Street and did not speak for perhaps 2 full minutes, and Gertrude stood and watched her mother hold her son and felt the full, complex, beautiful weight of everything that had brought them to this room. Harlan made coffee and stayed thoughtfully in the kitchen for the first part of the visit, and when he came out and was formally introduced to his mother-in-law, Hannah Atwood looked him over with the frank and comprehensive assessment of a woman who has been reading people her entire life and who had raised this particular daughter and therefore had a high standard. Then she said, "My daughter has her father's stubbornness and my own tendency to overthink things. I imagine you've had to navigate both." "I have," he said, completely straight-faced. "I found it worth the navigation." Hannah Atwood smiled at him with her gray-green eyes, the smile of a woman who has received exactly the answer she was hoping for, and said, "Good. Sit down, then. Tell me about this livery." The visit lasted 2 weeks and left everyone enriched by it in the particular way that honest family does, the kind that shows up and pays attention and says the true things with love rather than either suppressing them or weaponizing them. Hannah Atwood sat in the dressmaking shop and watched Gertrude work with the quiet, enormous pride of a mother seeing her child competent and free. She walked with Harlan to the livery one morning while Gertrude was feeding James, and Gertrude did not know what they discussed. But when Hannah came back, she gave Gertrude one long, tight embrace that said everything without words. On the last evening, Gertrude sat on the porch with her mother in the October cool, and her mother was quiet for a long time, looking at the street, at the cottonwoods in their autumn colors, at the warm window light of the house. "After James died," Hannah said, "I was afraid you would never come back from it." "I wasn't sure I would," Gertrude admitted. "You had the look of a woman carrying something impossible," her mother said. "Both times I saw you after." "You had it for a long time." She paused. "You don't have it now." Gertrude looked at her hands. "No," she said, "I don't. That man of yours," her mother did not look at her just at the evening street. "He's the right kind." "I know," Gertrude said. "I know you know," her mother said. "I'm just saying it so you know I know." She patted her daughter's hand once. "Your father sends his love. He doesn't always know how to give it directly, but it's there." "I know that too," Gertrude said. Hannah went home the next morning on the early train, and Gertrude stood at the station and watched the train go and felt the specific clean ache of loving someone and being apart from them, which was different from the old ache of being apart from everyone because you believed you were dangerous to them. This ache came from abundance, not from fear. That distinction mattered enormously. Harlan was waiting at the station gate with James on his hip, and a look that asked without asking how she was, and she said, "I'm good. I'm very good." And James grabbed at her hat, and she let him take it because there were days when you let a baby steal your hat, and it was the best possible use of the hat. The years that followed had the texture of lives well built and genuinely lived, full of work and weather and small daily pleasures, and the recurring challenges of any life honest enough to engage fully with the world. The dressmaking shop grew and Gertrude took on an assistant, a young woman named Clara who had arrived in Wichita from Iowa with a sewing kit and good hands and no immediate prospects, and who learned quickly and stayed and became, eventually, more of a partner than an assistant, which Gertrude found she not only approved of but had perhaps intended from the beginning. The livery expanded. Thomas, at 18, had become an essential and fully capable partner in it, his gift with horses now backed by a solid practical knowledge of the business. And when a neighboring property became available, Harlan and Thomas worked together to acquire it, expanding the stable and adding a proper training yard that served the community in ways that quickly exceeded what either of them had anticipated. Harlan was the kind of businessman who was good at it because he cared primarily about doing the thing well, and the doing the thing well turned out to be sufficient commercial strategy in a growing town. A second child arrived in the summer of 1887, a daughter this time, with Gertrude's gray-green eyes and Harlan's tendency toward emphatic silence when she was thinking hard about something. They named her Ruth Hannah Collier, the Hannah for Gertrude's mother, and James, who was 3 and had thoughts about most things, received his sister with the particular suspicion of a child who has been the center of considerable warmth, and is not entirely certain he wants to share the arrangement, followed gradually, over subsequent weeks, by a proprietary affection that was so intense it sometimes required gentle management. Thomas came to supper the Sunday after Ruth's birth and held her with the same gravity he had given James 3 years before, but with considerably more confidence this time, and Gertrude watched him hold her daughter and thought about the alley and the frightened boy and the offer of stable work, and was glad, as she was consistently glad, that they had found each other. On an evening in late summer of 1887, when Ruth was 3 months old, and James was running deliberately into the couch cushions for reasons that satisfied him completely, and Harlan was reading on the porch, and the locusts were doing their August business in the cottonwoods, Gertrude stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the warm, loud, completely particular life she had built and felt the full weight of its goodness. The cursed woman, she thought. The woman who drove men to grief by proximity. She thought of Harlan's voice saying, "A curse requires believing in it." She thought of the dry creek bed in the Oklahoma Territory, the small fire and the dark plain and the stranger walking toward it with a lame horse and a slight left lean and nowhere urgent to be. She thought of him sitting down. She had never fully thanked him for that, for sitting down, for the specific, uncalculated, obstinate act of sitting down beside her fire and saying, with complete equanimity, that he'd never had much luck either. She went out to the porch and sat beside him. Ruth was in the cradle inside, audible and content. James was audible and less content about the couch cushions but managing. "I never properly thanked you," she said. He looked up from his reading. "For what?" "For sitting down," she said. He looked at her for a moment, understanding what she meant. The Oklahoma Territory and the dry creek and the August dark and the fire and the cursed woman who told him to go. "You warned me fairly," he said. "I did. I made an informed decision. The least informed decision I have ever witnessed," she said, "and I am grateful for it every single day." He set his book down and reached for her hand in the gathering evening dark of the porch, and she gave it to him, and the locusts continued their business in the cottonwoods, and James made a conclusive sound about the couch cushions that suggested resolution of some kind, and Ruth slept in her cradle with the boneless peace of the very young. The sun finished its descent over the Kansas plain, and the sky above the cottonwoods of 2nd Street went dark and star-filled, The same enormous sky that had watched the cattle trails and the prairie grass, and the slow, irreversible transformation of wild country into something human beings were making their claims upon. For better and for worse, and in the complicated, inexorable way of history that always contained both. Harlan held her hand in the dark of their porch, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in the quiet of a life that had been built from the improbable decision to sit down beside a fire when told to leave, and the equally improbable decision to let him stay. And the accumulation of letters and miles and honest words and eggs slightly overcooked and apple fritters in a blizzard and a cracked church bell made right, and a baby's first steps and a mother's embrace on a station platform, and all the 10,000 ordinary, extraordinary moments that constitute a real love built between real people. She was not cursed. She had never been cursed. She had simply been afraid, and then she had been less afraid, and then, gradually and irreversibly, she had been unafraid, and the person most responsible for that shift was sitting beside her on the porch of their house holding her hand in the late summer dark. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I am glad you had bad luck," she said. He laughed, low and warm, the sound that had been one of her reliable pleasures for going on 5 years now. "That's an unusual thing to be glad about." "It brought you to that creek," she said, "on that night, lame horse and all." "Cora still holds a grudge about the shoe," he said. "She has a right to it," Gertrude said. "Without it we'd have passed each other in the dark and never known what we'd missed." He turned to look at her, and she could see his face in the starlight, the face she knew completely and continued to find surprising, the way that good things remain somewhat surprising no matter how long you have them. "We wouldn't have missed it," he said. "I don't believe we would have missed each other. The world's too small for that." "That is the most optimistic thing you have ever said," she told him. "I'm an optimistic man," he said. "You are," she agreed. "It was, I think, the first thing about you I could not argue with." She settled her head back against his shoulder. "That and the coffee." "The coffee was genuinely good," he agreed modestly. "It was the best coffee I'd had in 2 years," she said, "though I would not have admitted that at the time." "I know," he said. "You always seem to know." "Pays attention," he said simply. She smiled against his shoulder. Ruth made a small sound from inside, the investigating sound, not the demand, and James had quieted, probably asleep on the couch cushions he had been battling, which was a defeat of sorts and a victory of another kind. The summer night settled completely around the White House on 2nd Street in Wichita, Kansas, and the stars above the plains were very bright and very numerous, the way they were on clear nights in open country before the world filled up with the lights of the future. And under those stars was a porch and a house and a livery and a dressmaking shop and a baby in a cradle and a 3-year-old in defeat with couch cushions and 2 people who had found each other in the dark beside a dry creek and had, against the very specific advice of at least one of them, sat down together and not gotten back up. Gertrude Atwood Collier closed her eyes in the summer dark and listened to the night and felt, for the first time in as far back as she could clearly remember, that she was in exactly the right place in exactly the right life with exactly the right person beside her, and that nothing about any of it was the result of a curse or the absence of one. It was the result of a man who had never had much luck either, and who had sat down anyway, and who had been right. She had never been more glad of anyone being right in her entire life. And in the morning, the house on 2nd Street would wake up and be ordinary and good and hers, and the sky would come up over Kansas, and the livery bell would ring for the early shift, and James would have opinions about breakfast, and Ruth would investigate the morning with her mother's gray-green eyes, and Harlan Collier would make the coffee, and it would, as always, be very good, and they would go on building the days of a real life together, which was the only kind of life worth having, and which she had. After 4 years of dry creeks and campfires, and telling strangers to leave, come to understand, was precisely what she deserved.